Hello again. We're back for another demonstration. The subject today is boats. Now, I for one have spent a lot of time in canoes especially, but in boats as well. And I think many people, if not everyone, is very fascinated with water. So boats become an interesting subject. We're going to do a couple of quicker paintings today that include boats. These examples that I've drawn up ahead of time show examples where boats or canoes are lighter, or in this case, where they are darker and the surrounding is lighter. There are two options, and maybe some in-betweens as well. And we will proceed to demonstrate and craft a landscape around some boats. These are some student works, and in most cases the images in these paintings are lighter, and the surrounding landscape they've created is darker. And yet more student pieces, adding coastline or fogs or clouds or different kinds of boats can make it work. So an interesting subject. I've just illustrated a book, novel, and on the cover, the couple in this beloved novel is fond of canoeing, and they met canoeing, and so this ends up being the cover on the recently released book that I've done. An example of where the boats become dark again, and crafted landscape and memories of my fishing and so on, so you bring back connections to the water, etc. A couple of things to note in this scene. Silhouetted are both the boat, the land, and the fisherman. There's a little color in the boat and a little bit of detail, and the background is distant. We have a dark to light background so that the light part of the scene is further back. Birds and trees, pretty easily done. We'll do something like that later. And a close-up sketch of how these might work, where we have darks and lights coming together to create a focus, and the surrounding values are darker, so that this gets featured. Water darker, land darker, boat lighter. And another yet version where this old schooner gets pulled onto shore, probably seen its better days as his friend has here, and creating a landscape around such settings. Mystery, where the water leaves, and the water goes again from dark to light, the land from dark to light, the land from dark to light, the land from dark to light, and the boat from dark to lighter. Interesting, boats are a prominent subject. I've drawn a little sketch of a canoe. I just grabbed something off the internet, looking down into a canoe, and transferred it to this piece of paper, and I'm adding some landscape around it. In this case, I have added a horizon with some background trees. I've made a point of looking at the rule of thirds again, as we've heard in other discussions. And so when we divide the upper part of the painting into thirds, this tree drops near the 1/3 point. And of the distance from the horizon, which is also at a 1/3 line, 2/3 of it is lake, water, and canoe and shore. 1/3 sky and background. And we divide that into thirds, so you can hear that I'm, to speed things along, making sure that the rule of thirds works. When something goes along too level for such a distance, I end up creating some variation. So we end up with a background set of trees, a shoreline onto which the canoe is pulled. The shoreline leaves, some rocks pull in. We have the issue of large-scale mystery going out into the distance. I'm almost always wanting, after having lightly put down the drawing and thought of the composition, we have this placed at a 1/3 position, so there's a lot of power here. Then I'm going to lightly erase loose graphite again, still allowing myself to see the lines that I put down for proportion, etc. The first step here might be to create sky and to do it lightly with a larger brush. And so we move to our blues. We mix maybe the cerulean and the lighter blue, sky blue, and create, by rolling the brush and making the circles, creating a nice pocket of paint, and have at hand a test strip to see if it's in the density or value that you'd prefer, maybe slightly darker. Maybe a second blue, so we aren't beholden and struggling only with one. Lots of water, roll it around, and check. The trees and the sky can all be one, so in this case we will turn the painting to my advantage so that I can put my hand down and work with the paint, and I will add my paper towel to my hand and pull the water closer so they don't have to reach so far, and put water down and go just in this case to the horizon line. And I'm being careful by not pressing too hard near the tip and following along carefully, and then I can be wild and crazy after that. The idea is to saturate the trees and the sky totally. And careful at the horizon. So what we're doing is honoring that line. The horizon line is a pretty big deal on almost any painting, no exceptions here. I'm going to leave it sit for just a minute and think about our coloration. I'm going to want this to be lighter so that my eye goes off and that we darken this scene so we create an eye direction moving towards the upper left. In doing that, I'm going to start with slightly darker paint and a darker hue, going to the cobalt in this case. Going to put that into this scene and maybe darken it up just slightly more. And we can go a little bit into the trees, it doesn't matter. We're not adding water. Now I'm moving to the cerulean, but I'm going in the paint and pulling it out. Now taking the paint off and going to the pure cerulean. And without adding paint, I'm working on the lead edge, so we're going to almost white. And we're saying that advisedly. If I'm concerned again about the line, I'm going to go back in and put the paper in a position that I can control the edge. So we pretty much have the sky. We're going to then think of dropping in the trees. We're going to let it dry just a bit, but look for siennas and other colors, potentially quinacridone gold, which is a favorite color for a lot of people. And it's a rich sepia color. And because it is wetter, we start also with these trees being darker at this line, creating a horizon line. And maybe even better done if I turn my hand. So I use just the fingers and get that line to be accurate. Take some away, go to some lighter color, mixing some yellow in with the quinacridone gold, changing the color, going in again just like we did with the sky, changing the color, back to the gold, in and out. So we're changing the mix and essentially reinforcing the horizon line, but going from darker to lighter. We might end up with a little bit of additional darkness in some places along that line. And we're moving up towards the top now, but we don't brush too much. We let the wetness of the paper create a fuzzy, soft edge at the top. And I'm going to go for some darker sepia. At this end. And move a little bit along and move a little bit along. So we're doing color jump into this background. It's running nicely. This is exactly what we want it to do. So we're going to let that sit. And we prefer not to put the hair dryer on that to speed things along because it'll take away some of the character that we're looking at. So best thing to do is have coffee, which we may do shortly, or move on to another part of the painting. Let's keep that lake separate for a minute, or this river, whatever it might be, and do the same thing with the land. So let's wet the paper around the canoe. This is a form of negative painting. And we're only wetting the land area. And in this case, not too much water. So it's a moderate amount, not excessive, because we want more darkness. And the more water we add, the longer it'll take us to get it to be dark. In this case, we're going to have the canoe come out lighter and surround it with darkness, both in the water, on the land. And again, negative painting around the subject. And as you can tell, I'm pretty casual about what the colors are. I try to get several in a family of the browns, the earth tones, and creating pockets of them, including the ones I just used, and something moving towards greens. But the point is mixing up lots of colors and not sticking with just one or two. And we're getting to something closer to whole milk for most of these. That's a reasonable amount of water, not the darkest, not the lightest. Even the purples can work for us. So around we go, having lots of colors fortuitously in this particular palette. Starting at the boat, knowing to make the boat light, we need to start at darkness. We might put the darkness near the boat and get lighter as we go to the bottom edge of the paper. Being really careful not to get into the boat. So the line, the edge of the line is critical at this point. And of course, because it's a canoe, it needs to be smooth. Now I've gone over that edge just a bit, being careless, but easy fix, dry it and come back in. And with a drier paper, it'll hold it better. So as you can tell, I like lots of different colors. And we're going to move all the way around this canoe with some darkness behind. Negative painting. Without taking paint off my brush, I've added another color, so we again are mixing colors. And to be accurate and careful, I turn the paper. A little bit of wetness on the tape, we'll take it off. And we are telling ourselves, at least for now, that darker near the boat, lighter away. So that gives us clues about where we go in the palette for the paint. Darker near the boat. And the canoe has this little bit of a sweep going up. Then it gets thicker. So that line is pretty critical. Lots of color, and the paper is still damp, which is helpful. I added just a bit more water in one space, so it'll be runnier and less runny as we move along. Going for some yellow and other color to mix in and change some of these colors. We're going to start heading lighter in this direction, so we don't have the darkest out at this edge. It'll be warmer and lighter. And we're going to have to come back in and darken around the boat. We'll add a little bit of water there. And not forget our little special piece of land that juts out. Let's have it jut out and be horizontal for a longer piece. And darker. And alternate color. And we'll lighten the edge some, using it as a mop. And we'll darken, you find it here, the end piece. So each piece is moving that little piece from darker to lighter, darker to lighter, darker to lighter, darker to lighter. Having done that much and let the sky dry as we have, it's almost time. Well, we'll do a little bit more actually before that. Getting ahead of myself. Doing little strokes that might be grass, they could be pebbles. But if we did that, we did a cluster. We don't want to do leopard dots. We want to do clusters, and a spot, and a spot, and a cluster, smaller, and a spot, without adding paint. So it's just a little darker than what's there. Change the color just a bit. 2 or 3 stages to painting watercolor. This might be called getting the local color down, and we've done it 2 or 3 other things while doing that. Selected a whole range of colors, gone from dark to light, and kept that in mind. We've added different strokes. We've mixed colors on the surface, so we end up with something that could be beach-like and quite interesting. Next step is to dry, and then we'll come back to you shortly. Okay, next step is to complete the negative painting around the canoe. And we're going to do that by wetting the water, but we've done this separately. If we would have wet it while the land was wet, the colors would have merged and this desirable and sharper edge would have been lost. So we're doing the central piece separate from. Another trick, excuse me, is to leave a little white space. And we actually might do that. We won't go little dry space that is white paper up adjacent to the edge, and we can always take care of that in the end, so we don't go quite to. And we can dump a lot of water out in the middle of the lake. But we need to turn the paper to get to the canoe and to sharpen up that edge again. The entire water surface gets wet. Back to our blues. Starting with darker blue near the shoreline, and we'll start at the canoe again, knowing that we want it to be darkest near the canoe. It's a pretty pure color. And so a little bit of adulteration can happen by getting something to dirty it slightly, or change its nature just slightly. And we're going to be moving from dark near the boat to lighter as we move across the painting. Going to a different blue and going in and moving out still quite dark. And making point of not having any lines happen, and we're not doing big long strokes, we're doing shorter strokes, smaller sections at a time. And making sure that the shape, the negative shape of the canoe looks believable. When we come to the tip of the canoe, we're going to go around it for the issue of tangency, so that the color continues around and doesn't just stop at the tip of the canoe. And we're continuing ourselves out, but telling ourselves we want to go lighter and lighter. That might with brighter paint in the cerulean family as we go. And when we're doing water, we soon begin to do horizontal strokes. And so water lays on the land horizontally, follows of course the horizon, and we're moving towards the horizon. Might as well finish this section, And if this water is a little darker than the sky above it, now that's a little too dark, but we always have the ability to change and lift. Going back, sometimes at the ocean you'll see that this happens. It gets a little bit darker out there. So we end up really demarcating. And should we need it, we can lift one time slightly, 2 times, that to get a little more variation. We still have damp water, so we want to continue with some haste and speed. Back to the cobalt blue, plenty of it here. Back to darker paint in this section of the canoe. Mixing to the next blue, cerulean in and then out, and then pure cerulean beyond that. And if it's getting too dark near the horizon, we can come and lift some of it with these horizontal strokes. And we're going to leave a little bit of almost white. Some parts of your painting want to be white. And near the horizon of this painting, then we can draw in little strokes of horizontal color, and then we continue on finishing it. If it gets a little dry, which has happened, I'm just adding a bit more water around it. And horizontal strokes. When it's working wet and wet, we'll end up having less opportunity for lines to set up, which will be foreign to it being a water body. At the edge of the paper, let it be a little darker. As we move in, no more paint. Let it be lighter in the middle towards that center horizon line. So we're starting to get what we're after. Going to add just a little bit of additional line quality and darker tone here so our eyes don't leave the paper. And we're going to pull in just thin little strokes. Got to be in scale with that distant view so it becomes more believable. We'll also darken just a bit more underneath that guy. And so it ends up holding our eye out in this direction. As I see it, this has gotten just a little dark, so we'll lift, well, it's damp yet, just a bit more of it. And some little thin lines. Now this wants to be in scale and very light paint, not too many. Okay, so we've essentially surrounded our canoe with water. Drying next. We're coming back to the canoe and noting a few things that the image that we first started with against a lighter background, that end of the canoe is lighter against slightly darker background. So it goes from dark to light. That the inside is darker, lighter bottom and darker again. In piece. Light, very light seats, essentially no paint, and a white top and rim. So those are the things we take note of when we begin to render the canoe. Let's think of rendering it in, and so the biggest part of the canoe is here. Actually, we're going to do it in red, kind of red. We have a red handy, so let's use it. A red and a brown. So without putting, this is now on dry paper, in order for this to stay red and for the paint not to run, and be careful, I'm going to start with the darkest of the reds, and it goes right up to the end, but this needs to be carefully done. And we continue to turn our paper so that we can see our work and holding the brush just like a pencil, which is something we're most familiar with and gives us the greatest amount of control. We can add a little bit of additional blue to that should we want it later. And we're heading towards a lighter color towards the other end. But we have quite a ways to go, so we can keep some additional red for a good while. So we're not outlining the whole edge, we're doing a short stroke and we're creating a little landing with the same color. And we're moving down and pulling this down along the edge, but in small amounts. And we're keeping in mind that we want this gradation to work. Going to go back for a little bit of the cobalt and drop it in to the upper end to darken this red even further. And then use the paper towel and smooth it down. And we can come back in and charge it one more time with red for brightness. If we don't have the paint too wet, then we got to be careful about that. If it's too wet, we'll come back and just add more dry paint and work our way out. So sometimes you do it 2 or 3 times to get it right, but we want to make sure we have this value change as we move down. We're on dry paper, but what I'm going to do now, because we're doing lighter paint, is put a little water in front of my work and paint into the water so that won't set up as an edge while I busy myself with the back section here as we move down. Turn the paper. Now I've not added more paint, wanting to get it to be almost white, a surprise. So we have a full range of color on the canoe. We'll end up having some darkness underneath with the shadows that we've talked about. So that's essentially painting a canoe. Watercolor always has a tendency to dry lighter and less bright than you want, so we may have to come back and brighten this one more time to get it to our liking. I'm working now with something closer to heavy cream, but as we saw, this can now go quicker. Once we have the initial color and the gradation down, we can turn the brush and brighten this up just a bit, touch the paper, new edge, touch the paper, new edge, touch the paper, new edge, and get just a bit of additional brightness into the red painting. Feels better. Next step is to anchor the canoe to the ground. There's a darker bottom edge and a darker shadow underneath. So that's what we'll do, and we'll do that in the brown and the red of the land underneath. Right now I'm thinking about heavy cream, a darker color, and so we're going to do that, and that edge will be just below the canoe. It won't go up, it'll turn this way a bit, so it's like a shadow, but not quite. To the land, and soften that edge just a bit. Blue next, underneath, and moving out, and they meld where they meet. Since cobalt blue is among the best for shadowing, we'll use it as a continuation on the bottom edge of the canoe for that dark piece we saw in the image of a minute ago. So that line becomes less strong, and it's got a value. Cobalt blue, mid-range, and lighter than what we've just put down. And it can have a bit of lines in it, but not a lot. Soft edge. Soft edge. A little bit of a hard edge there on the water. Okay. Dry again. As you go along, certain things will bother you, and there are times when they're already dry. So to show the Fritz scrubber, it's coming in small and large sizes, a fair amount of water. I'm looking out here and there's a pencil line in that background. So I'm going to easily, with water and medium pressure, scumble it away so that line will disappear. And with a clean paper towel, lift that so it's got a little bit of additional life. There are a couple of other places where the pencil line is showing briefly. And with clean paper towel, lifting those upper edges. Also on this edge, which got a little strong, I'm going to take the scrubber along, A-L-O-N-G, the edge, so that edge isn't quite as strong. Dry again. So we've got the boat started. We'll save the interior of the boat to the very end. We're going to finish then texturing. What we have now is local color on the water, sky, tree background, and on the beach, with value change and with little colors mixed in. So we need to complete the surroundings, then we'll do the final finishing of the boat. So I'm thinking that this boat could benefit by having a rock somewhere in the middle part of the scene. So this peninsula is an opportunity to drag the stone into the scene. Adding rocks to the scene and additional interest in the water, and probably some cattails or some other grasses with it. So a peninsula extension out, dividing that into thirds, thinking about there and that division into thirds. I'm thinking that it's something in this zone. And it needs to be, if it's here, of size. It might even have a friend. So we have a couple of additional pieces. And we can test it with a pencil, but I'm imagining some grasses around these guys. So, next step. Okay. Adding those rocks into the scene. And we're going to add some additional detail. And that adds life into the scene and more interest around the canoe. What we're doing is adding elements around the canoe for interest. Going to the rigger brush to do these grasses. I'll do them in a dark green. Holding my list. So, individual strokes coming up, lifting as you come up, so there is a thinness to the line. They don't want to be thick because they're in a distance and they're, after all, they're grasses. And some of them can stand in the water. And so we're adding texture and interest around the subject's surface. We can also do some stones near the canoe on this side. So we'll divide that into thirds, and we'll divide that into thirds, and we'll put some stones right here. One pebble, flatter bottom, another pebble, and maybe another one. And that's easy enough to do with the brush by taking some of the original colors in slightly darker hues again and painting around them. So it's just like painting around the canoe. We're doing negative painting around the rocks. But in order for the rocks to arrive, the soil and stuff around them needs to be darker, the beach, and without edges. That's a hard one to accomplish. Around we go, and not an outline, so we're not going all the way around. We're just blending it off and softening the edges so they disappear. That's not quite gone enough. There we go. And around, and maybe not around the entire rock. And maybe there's a little one that just arrived by its own, on its own accord. So we're beginning to see interest in the foreground. So rocks tying to rocks. This whole beach goes along, and it has less interest because of its uniformity. So let's divide it into thirds and reinforce the boat again so we can end up putting a rock right there. Dark, lighter brown. Ultimately we'll get something. And so we can alternate and lift part of the surface so it's both light and dark. And we can go dark around the bottom side. Then I'm working on the edge to soften the edge. So we've added interest to our boat. If we dried it, then we'll make way for grasses. Well, do we need one more rock? Probably do. This one will do that distance, divide it in thirds, and off the paper. And then we only have to do the brown around some part of, or the green, whatever it is, some parts of the top. Wet paper, no more paint. Thin, dark to light around the edge. The rock appears. And we add interest, leading us into the painting. I'm noticing that there's a sharp edge right there, so we're going to take that off and go for some really dark paint for that guy at the bottom edge. And maybe a little bit of dark paint on the bottom edge of a couple of these other guys. And even here. We're going to darken that just a bit. And dry. So we're continuing on to add interest around the boat and the which is the focus of the painting. So now that we've got some of the rocks in, we can add some additional grasses. The grasses, if we wish, can be lighter. So we can have a combination of light and dark grasses. Something along the shoreline needs to be dark in the realm of indigo. And some darks in the foreground. Test strips are always wise. Get too much paint on the brush, we gotta test it. And what we're doing is reinforcing the area of the boat and then adding a few others for interest in other places. We'll do a little bit more with that in a minute. We'll have this boat pulled right up into the weeds, so it has the texture around it. We can get rid of that in a minute if we need to. A little bit of darkness along the edge of the rock. This is the time to think about some shadows from some of those grasses, reflections down, and a little bit of a shadow underneath the rocks. And we'll do a little bit of shadowing on this side of the rocks, leaving the tops light. Especially the one in the foreground here. Just a little bit of shadow. And just a little bit of interest. Okay. Doing this allows us to have to do less with the remainder, but there's still a bit to do. Using a mid-sized stroke, I'm going to just put some paint down. This is the breadcrumb hold where you're putting the brush down, making some crazy zigzag strokes, adding some texture and interest to the ground plane. With paint again that's slightly darker, adding a little bit of indigo to the green, and just making some texture marks on the surface of the local color that we've added earlier. Sometimes you want to do just a bit of stroking and dabbing for the interest. And the brush is pretty dry, so we're not painting, we're having the texture of the paper take paint off the brush for interest. So adding life to that zone. We're doing the same in the zone. We're starting, of course, again near the boat, and doing less as we move away from the boat. A little bit of texture, a little bit of texture. And because it's lighter at this end, less texture will do the trick. And if we end up erring and it's a little too dark, there we go. So it's looking close, but my eye went right here. So I'm going into this zone and adding carefully with the brush, and even with a little bit of darker, some texture right there to relieve the boat. We'll do a little bit of additional right there. And we'll break that up just a bit. So we have boat on shore. In the background, there is an opportunity to get long distance perspective, so we won't miss that while we're thinking about it. We'll add just dividing that into thirds again. At this third, out here, a small scale island with some trees on it. And if it's too dark, we can lift. And if we mess up with paint, as I've just done with the blue, we can come in with the scrubber and be sure that we have a clean paper towel, and we can lift that back to essentially white. If we need to, a little more scrubbing. And we can make it into a little brown island out there in the distance. We also have an opportunity to add just a little bit of additional value near the ground plane on this horizon. So the horizon shows up just a bit more, and it's often in shadow of the trees that the lower part is darker. Not uniformly, not all the way along, just little bits. So there's a little bit of additional life. And this is up north. Possibly there is a evergreen tree or two sticking through the top, and we'll lighten those guys. So there's additional interest there. So the last remaining thing to do is to render the internal part of the boat. Let's go back for some clues. And looking now specifically at the internal part, we noticed earlier that it's darker to lighter, and the bottom part's a little bit brown. So we're going to do then next the local color in the boat. We're not going to do the thwarts or the seats, which are lighter. And we're going to do a couple of different browns and putting some color, not the upper edge. So we're going to keep that white for now. So we're separating the parts, the seats and the crossbars, the thwarts, from the remainder. If there's blue paint on the brush, that adds a little bit of additional interest. And so I'm doing the lighter part of the paint currently. And between, around. So we're having the internal parts of the boat arrive through negative painting. Around the seat, there's little spaces between the seat, little spaces between that seat with a little connector, and then down we go. And essentially coloring the whole inside with a lighter brown. We'll do it because it's a little darker up here, and we know that. We're going to come up and across and down and start just a bit darker and make sure that the dimension of the exterior top is not too big. Then we're going to darken that piece and the band along the top, and the seat arrives. There's lighter. And around we go, and down the edge. And we have to get this down 2 dimensions so it isn't too thick on the top. There we go. Turn the painting so we can work on the edges that are most concerned. And we have a blending of value. Going now for a slightly darker brown. And we're going to darken this piece in nice sharp corners. Nice sharp corners. Some ways down. Almost all of that will be dark. Then there'll be a little bit of darkness here, but we're not adding paint to the brush. We're letting it run out. And we're doing just the upper edge. The bottom stays lighter. And so we'll lift up some paint there. And this will get darker again down here. Little square end around the seat. Little space between the seats. And that upper edge. So we have a boat that has a lighter interior bottom. Once dry, which we'll do now, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to take that little red mark of paint away with the Fritz scrubber by rubbing a fair amount of water, one spot, and only medium pressure. With any luck, it will disappear. Pretty much has. We have to dry it now. And we'll look for clues on our boat. We see how the ribs run. They run down and create a circle and across the bottom. So we will do that. And we'll give ourselves some pencil clues before starting. We don't need to do them all necessarily. There needs to be a round curve to that corner. So we'll add those guys for where they can be seen, plus a little bit of additional work. All of this being done with the rigger moving just slightly darker into the quinacridone gold, we can, and our hand in a firm movement, we can add the ribs. Did several without going back to paint, but we'll now go back to paint. We're going to narrow that down just slightly so the top edge isn't quite as big, and we're going to go across the seat there with the brown so it isn't quite so big. And finish the interior part. And once the idea is there, you can be somewhat casual with it. And we're going to add a little bit of depth and dimension to the seats by having an edge that's a little darker, an edge of that band is a little darker. We're going to put a little mark on the seats so there's some detail. And pretty soon we're having it look like the Canoe that we started with. If it needs to be a bit darker, we can do that. Okay. And some marks on the seat for texture, a little bit of texture on the surface. One last thing, we can go to even a darker red, alizarin crimson, to brighten up the red of the boat. We want to check on that, make sure that it's the red we want. It looks great. And so we can darken up the front just a bit more over the top of the paint that's already graded as a wash. So it, as you can see, it begins to add additional brilliance to the Canoe. And gets rid of any lines that have formed. And if that needs to be just a bit narrower, don't want to be too casual. Okay. Okay. So one could do more things. We could add some canoe paddles. We could look to darken. There's probably a little more work to do to darken certain places to reinforce an edge of the canoe, or to get rid of an edge that's formed so it looks continuous and smooth. We could add a person if we wanted, canoe paddles, other things. But I think for this demonstration, this is where we want to stop. We'll put a mat on it just to see how it looks. Always looks better with a mat. And to see the scene and talk through what we've done. We've placed a canoe. We've added a landscape around the canoe. We've added a horizon line with trees, painted the sky and trees at once and added the trees into the wet sky, painted the ground, third, drying each time, painting the lake, and darker around the subject to have it come forward with a fair amount of light. We have one last thing we could do, now that we're thinking about it. We could come in with just slightly, little amounts, so there's not pure white on the edge. We can just add bits of color into any zones that are white to get a sense of it being not pure white, which is unlikely. So we'll now move to a second demonstration.